Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to welcome Professor Christof Mauch and all of you around the world who are online and also who are here in Pécs. We are very delightful to have you here at our first Environmental Humanities talk in the University of Pécs. And this event is hosted by the Environmental Humanities Research Group and the Department of European Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology of the University of Pécs. The talk is around 19 minutes, and after that we have a 10 minutes break, and from 20 to 4 until 4:30 we have a question and comments section. The talk is going to be recorded. It is a very special privilege for me to introduce our first invited speaker, Professor Mauch, who I met the first time 10 years ago at the Rachel Carson Center when I attended at the Global Environmental Summer Academy. And this time, and also after being a Carson Fellow, influenced my work very much. So thank you very much for this. So Professor Christof Mauch is a director of the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society and chair in American Cultural History at the LMU in Munich. He's a honorary professor and a senior fellow at the Center for Ecological History and Renmin University in China, and the past president of the European Society for Environment History, and the former director of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. His recent books include Slow Hope, Rethinking Ecologies of Crisis and Fair. It was published in 2019. And Urwald der Bayern, it's about the Bavarian's primeval forest. And his last book, titled as Paradise Blues, Reisen in die Natur und in die Geschichte der USA. So now I would like to ask him to give his lecture with his, what he titled as What are the Environmental Humanities Good For? Research, Education, and New Perspectives for the 21st Century. But before that, please join me in welcoming Christof Mauch.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this very kind introduction. Thank you for coming to this talk. This is the longest table I've ever seen. It's I wish I could speak Hungarian. Jó napot kívánok, köszönöm. It's about the extent, but it's wonderful to be here. And it's wonderful for a number of reasons. First of all, because it makes me think about something that I really haven't thought about before. What are the environmental humanities and what are they good for? When I was asked to answer this question, I thought, wow, this is a great question. If only I knew the answer. I'm happy here because to see that in this university, which is a great university with a very strong humanities and social science faculty, the environmental humanities are springing up like they're springing up all over the world, but it's wonderful to see it here. And I'm also very happy to be back in Pécs. This was a place that I visited when there were only trabis and ladas driving around in the 1980s. I was invited by a professor. I was a student at that time. I will never forget it, and I really I visited it twice. And when you visit a place, things get stuck in your mind and your memory. And there are a few things that I can't get out of my memory. The first thing is the city center. With, where else in the world can you find a place that has multiple churches from different ages, and a synagogue and mosques? No other city. So this is a city of diversity. Of course, also of conflict, but a city of variety and diversity. But the other thing that really strikes me, and what I remembered, was this dialogue between nature and culture in this city. The mountains, the geology, and what I saw yesterday, the water mill and the water that makes the stone that the city is built out of. But also, of course, the nature in dialogue with the city, the making of the wine in the vineyards here. And the third thing that struck me when I was here, when it was cultural capital, was the transformative power, because this wonderful porcelain factory that you have in the city was transformed into creative spaces and exhibitions. And in a way, what I just said, you know, the diversity of the place, the dialogue between culture and nature, and the creative and transformative phenomenon that you encounter here is, in a way, the definition of the environmental humanities. So I'm done with my talk. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, really, diversity, a dialogue between culture and nature, and transformative creativity. Now, I have 90 minutes left, or 85, and I feel sorry for you. It's very easy for me to talk. Those of you who know me know that. But it's difficult to listen, especially to a relatively dry topic, what is the environmental humanities and all this teaching and research stuff. So I hope you survive it. Buckle up. I was wondering how to approach this topic, and I have to apologize now, but I think I will take that jacket off. It's so warm here. It's wonderful, sunny. Looks like Mediterranean. I'm wondering where it's the sea. The Mediterranean must be just around the corner. Also, the guest house where I'm staying looks like Italy. Anyway, so this my apology for not wearing a jacket. But you saw I have one. So I was wondering, should I talk about the whole landscape and the research that has been done over the last few years? Even today, I got an email that said there's a new series coming up entitled Environmental Humanities in German, but they use the English title. It's Metzler publishers are publishing it. But I realized that it's probably better to talk about something that I know a little about, and that is the Carson Center and what we are doing at the Carson Center in terms of research and teaching. And then I will be very subjective about the future. So this is my table of contents. Where am I coming from? I'm coming from the Rachel Carson Center. What are we doing at the Rachel Carson Center? Who is Rachel Carson, and why did we name our center after her? What are the environmental humanities? What are they? What are the challenges with this new, is it a discipline or the field? What are the major challenges and problems that we're facing? What are terminological, institutional, and political challenges? Then I talk a little about a couple of research projects at the Rachel Carson Center. Then I talk about teaching, and only about projects that I've been involved with myself over the last few years. There are field seminars, exhibitions, and expert discussions. And I ask, why are the environmental humanities relevant? Are they relevant? Why are they relevant? If yes, why? Why are they relevant now? What are they good for? But also, what are they good against? And finally, I look into some perspectives for the future. Now, you know, when number 6 comes up, you can open your eyes again, actually. Now, you can, I know how horrible it is to listen and to, I'm fine with you closing your eyes while you listen. I have a few slides, but they are less important than what I'm trying to say. Oh yeah, I have one slide in the end, which I try to answer why we should study environmental humanities, and why I hope that this is just the beginning of a cooperation between the Rachel Carson Center in Munich and your research group here. So this is the Rachel Carson Center in the city of Munich. It was started in 2009, and it was started as a center for advanced study, which means we invited fellows from all over the place who came to write books and articles. We've had over 300 fellows, and these fellows have written, came from over 60 countries, from every continent. And they stayed for 3, 6, 9, or 12 months to write books on a variety of topics. And we were funded in the beginning. for 12 years by the Federal Ministry of Research and Education. And the Carson Center came out of a collaboration between our university, Ludwig-Maximilians University in Munich, and the Deutsches Museum, Germany's largest museum, which is also in Munich. And that was a great start for our center. And for 12 years, we got a lot of funding. But it ends, and it has to end, because the maximum funding you can get from the Federal Ministry is 12 years, 6 plus 6. So we also did, even though we got money for fellows to come and write books, we also did a lot of outreach, like lectures, workshops, film events. Every semester we have multiple film events. Our Green Vision series, together with the Adults College, and together with the Doc Festival, with a documentary film festival. So we invite experts who discuss films, filmmakers, but also environmental experts who discuss environmental films in a public space. So outreach is really important to us. And we've done exhibitions, including a big exhibition that my colleague Helmut Trischler and others did at the Deutsches Museum on the Anthropocene, which drew over 300,000 visitors. We have graduate programs, and by now the graduate programs are the center of the Rachel Carson Center. We started with a structured doctoral program. We also have a certificate. A certificate is something that you do in addition to a master. So you get a master, let's say, in geology or in theology or in mathematics. Actually, we have students from every faculty at LMU, and they do, in addition, a certificate in environmental studies. So they have to attend classes, and this is important. They have to attend classes in natural science, social science, and the humanities. So in the whole diversity of disciplines. It's 33 ECTS points, if that means something to you. The master is 180. So it's smaller, but it's very hard to study your main subject and then the environmental studies at the same time. But it's great because you're grounded in one discipline, and then you're like a T, you're moving away. You're being grounded on one hand, but then moving into other areas. We will start a master in environment and society soon in October, and we got funding from the Volkswagen Foundation. And we have not just a structured doctoral program, but also together with the University of Augsburg, an international doctoral school with 20 doctoral students. And we have had EU-funded innovative training networks for doctoral students with other universities around the globe. And we talked a little about maybe future collaboration with Pécs in the future, perhaps on such a program. Well, because we have no money, very little money, so all the money is now basically coming from my chair. And it's very expensive to live in Munich. We were really lucky to have a Landhaus. So you see the Landhaus here. I'm standing in front of it. I'm sorry, can you still see me? Now, this is the Landhaus, so the fellows are living here on the top. This is where they eat. This is a study room. Here's an open fire. They have their own kitchen. And the stipends are now very low, but there is a high interest in these Landhaus stipends. It's 1.5 hours by public transportation from Munich. We got about 250 applications for 10 fellows living up here last time. So we can pursue this. We will continue this program for several years to come. One of our prides is the virtual presence. So we call it the portal. The Portal for Environment and Society is an online publication. So it's a portal that basically is a door that leads into all sorts of interesting publications in the field of environment and society, like virtual exhibitions, like other publications, some of them our own, some of them that we get from elsewhere. You can also search for them by time or by space or by topic. For instance, if you punch in natural catastrophes, you find teaching materials, you find publications, articles, etc. And we have a multimedia library, so also artistic products, etc. And altogether 2.7 million unique visitors from every country in the world, I think with the exception of North Korea. So we've been visited by more than 200 countries. So the portal is not only our door into research and media that you can use for free, but it's also our communication with the wider world. So why Rachel Carson? Well, those of you who know Germany know that Germans are really good at using names of famous Germans for their German men, Heisenberg professors and the Humboldt Foundation and the, I don't know, Goethe Institute, Max Planck, all these men. And the idea behind the original grant was to internationalize the humanities in Germany and to interdisciplinarize the humanities. That's what we got money for 12 years. And I thought, when I thought of a name, perhaps because I'm an Americanist, I thought of Rachel Carson. I wanted to have a name that is internationally visible and the name not of a German man. So Rachel Carson seemed like the ideal name. And I think she is, in a way, also the ideal person for the environmental humanities, because she is a scientist. She's a great scientist, originally a biologist, but at the same time, she is a popular writer. And those of you who've read Silent Spring, her book that came out in the early 1960s, know that it reads like a thriller. It starts like a novel. It's a scientific book. And in a way, this is what we're trying to do. We try to do serious science, and that's what the environmental humanities are doing, but at the same time, write it in a way and communicate it in a way that everybody can understand it. And finally, she had a political impact. And I think the environmental humanities are good at being relevant in the world out there. It's always an answer to my question. Rachel Carson is an answer to my question, what are the environmental humanities? Because she, as some of you know, her book had such an impact that in the end, DDT was forbidden by President Kennedy and the administration in the 60s. And also many historians would say that Rachel Carson's presence in the discourse in the 1960s triggered the rise of the environmental movement, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So she is an environmental humanities model for us. Now, what are the environmental humanities? It's springing up all over the world. It's amazing. About 4 years ago, we invited people, directors from 26 centers around the world to Munich. And almost all these centers had not existed before. They had sprung up within 10 years or so. So the environmental humanities, first of all, is a very new thing. It's something that people are fascinated by recently. And so it's a reaction to something that's happening in society. It's a reaction to the destruction of the planet. It's a reaction to its resources and its species. But it's also, and that's, in a way, it's obvious, but it's still important to emphasize this. It is about the dialogue between nature and culture. Natural scientists can focus on something that they explore in nature alone. Cultural studies can look at culture alone. But in the environmental humanities, it always needs to be both. So if you study, let's say, building a road through somewhere, or it has an impact on nature. Imagining a great city, it has an impact on whatever the natural environment is. But if you study nature, let's say if you're interested in changes to nature, it always has an impact for humans as well. So seeing the two things together is key for the environmental humanities. So if somebody says, well, let's just change. Let's say reintroduce some species. This is what is being done in Siberia, for instance. Let's introduce some species in Siberia. What impact does that have on the land, but also on humans is important. So we always ask, what impact has nature on culture? What impact has culture on nature? And then it is also transdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary means you talk across disciplines, like biology, literature, law, etc. But transdisciplinary means you talk beyond the ivory tower. So you talk to people out there who are stakeholders, politicians, etc. This is a simple answer, but there are problems. At least 3 problems. One is a terminological problem. I will tell you that we already had letterhead and business cards for the Rachel Carson Center, and they said, Rachel Carson Center for Environmental Studies. And I remember distinctly, we were sitting around a table and there was a Canadian political scientist and a British literary scholar, and the British literary scholar said, environmental studies, that's environmental science. And the Canadian political scientist said, oh, no, environmental studies must be literature. So I realized, oh, this term, environmental studies, is a problem because it means different things for different people. And I realized that we shouldn't use it. This is why we call the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, because it's a great umbrella that doesn't discriminate against other disciplines. I don't normally use environmental humanities, but we will have a chair in environmental humanities next year, so a new professorship. And we needed to use that term because it's used in the literature, because we established it in the literature department, and the literature department likes it. But there is a problem with the term environmental humanities because the scientists will say, well, you're just talking to humanists. And there's a problem with environmental humanities because the historians will say, well, we already have environmental history, and normally the environmental humanities people are philosophers or literary scholars. So there is a terminological problem. I just want you to be aware of it. You could also call it a challenge. Americans call everything a challenge. Germans call everything a problem. Institutional, it doesn't really fit. I mean, where does it fit? Which faculty? Because even our environmental studies, you can imagine, we have people from physics, from geography, from biology, teaching, ecology, etc. We are, because my chair is in American cultural history, so the Carson Center is in literature and languages. It doesn't fit in the university. You need to restructure the university, really. The environmental humanities are so much trans-faculty that this is a challenge, an institutional challenge. And it leads to the fact that out of the 26 people who were running centers that we invited, many of them have a center that does outreach, like film screenings and artistic things, but there are very few study programs so far. So to study environmental humanities is not easy. It's very, very difficult, by the way, on the bachelor's level. So in Australia, they started to do it on the bachelor's level, but it's better to already have a bachelor in some discipline and then to spread out and to build on top of that. It works really well with our certificate in addition to a master, and then you can move on to a doctorate. And by the way, we established a doctorate in environmental humanities at the Rachel Carson Center in our faculty. The literature people liked that. They were fine with it. They're fine with us because I can say this, I'm in Hungary, because we draw a lot of money for them. But that is also one of the political things. In a way, the problem is that environmental humanities are operating out of a defensive position. And what I mean by that is let's say somebody says Hungarian literature should be cut off because too few students are doing it. Why do we need it? Is it necessary in the 21st century to study Hungarian literature or Scandinavian literature? I mean, you will want to study Finnish literature probably in Hungary because of the language reasons, but why? If there are only a few people, many of these professorships get cut down. And there are quite a few, for instance in Britain, who say, well, before we get cut down, let's just call ourselves environmental humanities. And so we've seen a lot of professorships that are now focusing more on eco-criticism because it is relevant. It's politically relevant. But it's seemingly a position of strength, but it's also, to some extent, a reaction. So it's apologetic, it's defensive, it's a reaction, it's also a response. It also comes out of a certain weakness, not out of a position of strength necessarily. But it's political. So calling yourself environmental humanities can be an advantage because the university administration will say, well, this sounds good. It's relevant. So remember that. If you are threatened, it could be something that keeps you from extinction if you call yourself environmental humanities and not such and such literature. There's a tendency to claim globality while having a Western bias. I think this is a problem. If you look at, there's no environmental humanities program, let's say in Cameroon, Kenya, Kazakhstan. They are in Australia, Canada, the US, and Europe. So do we have a bias? We claim that we are speaking for the world, but are we really? So there is this problem of potentially a Western bias. These are the challenges. Doesn't mean that this is not an important field in the country, but is it a field? I'm showing you a rice field here. Am I standing in front of the picture all the time?
It's okay.
Should I, is it better like this?
Yes.
Okay, I'm showing you a rice field here. And maybe you want to tell somebody that environmental humanities is a discipline. It could be an advantage. Sometimes it's an advantage to claim that you're a discipline. So if you need to argue that it's a discipline, this is how I would argue. There are three factors that I find interesting. Epistemologically, what I mean by this is, if you look at how did new disciplines come about, let's say neuropharmacology or biochemistry, they were always like a confluence of two traditions or more. So they didn't come out of nothing. A new discipline is typically created by realizing, oh, you collaborate with another discipline and something new comes up, and it's so important that you turn it into a new discipline. So you can argue this is the case with the environmental humanities because several traditions coalesce. So that would be a criterion for a discipline. I know no example of a new discipline that didn't have a socio-institutional element to it. And what I mean by it, let's say, I know the German situation better because I did German history and German literature I did German literature in my first PhD. So in Germany, but I think in other countries as well, America a little bit later, in the 19th century, it was necessary to have education as a discipline because all of a sudden you have a grammar school and you realize you have to go beyond the regular discipline. So you have to establish something that is an answer to a professional need. I mean, if you need to train priests, the university has a theology department. You need to train teachers, you have an education department. So it's, in the case of the environmental humanities, this is also the case. Starting about in 1970, you see environmental protection agencies internationally, nationally, on an urban level. You see foundations, and all these people need staff. They need people who can talk about environmental protection and are not specialized, but they can communicate across disciplines. So in a way, this is one of the reasons why it's springing up. So you could call it a discipline because it's a socio-institutional answer to a need in society. It provides professional competencies. So people who come out of our environmental studies program, they are in the environmental protection agency, they're working in environmental foundations, they're working on eco-farms or starting eco-farms. They're not only working in academia, they're working with the city, with the Green City movement in Munich, etc. So they find jobs. So environmental humanities seems to have an answer to this need, the professional and career need. And then there's a political thing. In 19th century Germany, Germans became very nationalistic. Before that, the discipline of Germanistic didn't exist, German studies, and the discipline of history didn't exist. There was no history. But as soon as you realize, okay, we need to understand who we are, you establish a new discipline. And the discipline was German studies, Germanistic, and history. So for national identity, this was necessary. And I think the same thing is the case with the environmental humanities. It's a political situation in which we are answering by establishing a new discipline. So if you want to argue it's a discipline, you can argue like this. This is the argument. Now, what do I think? I don't believe myself. But I have to admit that I once argued like this in order to get a grant, and it worked, more or less. But if I showed you a picture of what the field looks like, and I say it's a field, I think it would be a very different picture. You can picture it yourself. I think it would be a picture not of a rice field that is disciplined. I think the environmental humanities are either a very undisciplined discipline or no discipline at all. They are a field. So if you imagine it as a picture, I think it would be a landscape that has wilderness and gardens and trees and flora and fauna. So it would be something very, very broad and wide. And this is also good to argue. It's important when you want to join in want to bring in colleagues from different faculties. This is the argument that you have. You can say the environmental humanities are not discriminating against any of this. They are diverse. They can involve people from all sorts of disciplines and faculties. So I think it's a field. Imagine not a rice field, but something much more exciting and complex and difficult to capture. Now, research at the Carson Center, I won't talk about all the 19 externally funded projects that we have, but here are two pictures. The one on the left shows you or reminds me that we have a project on transnational parks. So you all know national parks. I mean, you have a national park authority here in town for this part of the country, but there are national parks, let's say, at the border of Spain and France in the Pyrenees. There are national parks in the Wattenmeer in the North Sea that where multiple nations are involved, Netherlands and Germany. There are national parks at the border between the Czech Republic and Germany, the Bavarian National Forest and the Šumava on the Czech side. What does it mean to be a national park, but to have a counterpart, another park on the other side? This is interesting. I've been involved in the project on the national park in the Bavarian National Park. And even if you look at education, just to give you one example, this is not what the project is about, but I just remember this. I was talking to people who work on both sides, and they would say, well, the kids in the Czech Republic know all the names of the species, of the fungi, of the trees, of the plants. The kids on the German side know much more about ecology and what the function of the forest is. So there's a cultural difference. So it is interesting. There are many, many other questions, political questions that are interesting. They change with the regime change. So politics play a major role. So it's not always the same. There are also other very, very difficult questions to answer. For instance, the wolves are coming over, the lynxes are coming over. Were they brought over by the evil neighbors in the Czech Republic to Germany? Will there be bears? Will they eat up our sheep? So these questions are asked in that project. I got too much into detail with it. Here is another project. We have two medical projects at this point. This one is called Bloodborne. It's about the fact, and I think currently we see this, how important it is to look at the pandemic. Before that, we've had all sorts of other pandemics. We've had viruses and diseases. But to look at now we look at the animal-human relationship, who transported the viruses, but it's also an environmental topic. Let's say, if you look at Africa, there are plantations built into areas that used to be wild areas. What does it mean that colonials come in and change these wilderness areas into plantation areas? It creates a totally new fauna, it creates a totally new flora, it brings new viruses. So there are all these aspects that have an impact on health. And all of a sudden we define a hotspot and say, okay, in Africa there's this disease hotspot. But who brought it? It's not the Africans. It could well be a colonial issue. So this is one of our projects at this point. It's an ERC project. I will focus a little bit more extensively on one particular project, which is done by a group of younger scholars, and show you why I think this could be a model project for other future projects. Just one more. This is, I'm sorry. So this is another one that I was involved in. Actually, it's about, it's an Interreg project. So 6 countries come together, get an EU grant. They get EU money for this. And the question behind this grant was, what happens to cultural monuments? Let's say museums, churches, really valuable monuments, heritage monuments, when there is a natural disaster. And I think environmental humanities are really good at this, understanding avalanches, understanding flooding, understanding what happens in the Alps once these buildings are threatened. You need to have knowledge about the culture. So we have the dialogue with art historians, with the Denkmalamt, the conservation agency, but also with the Environmental Protection Agency. And this type of project is actually, we had 6 nations involved, all 6 alpine nations, except for Liechtenstein, because they don't have that much relevance for this topic. So the idea was to safeguard cultural heritage from natural hazards. Now I'm talking about one project in particular that is led by a younger colleague, Simone Müller. It's called Hazardous Travels. and I'm focusing on it because it's almost done. And it's called Ghost Acres in the Global Waste Economy. It's funded by the German Research Foundation. So all these projects are funded by the German Research Foundation, AHRC, EU, or the Volkswagen Foundation. So it's really important to get this money. This is what I was alluding to before when I said the literature people like us because we get some money, because they get some too. Actually, they get more than we do. But this project is talking about ghost acres. I don't know whether you know this term, possibly not. Ghost acre is a term that is used, for instance, if you plant, let's say you have animals here, but the food comes from elsewhere. You don't see these acres where the food comes from. The corn is grown in Brazil and it's brought over here, and the pigs feed it on it here. So it's a ghost acre. So you don't see it, it's a ghost. It's ghosting. But the same thing is true for ghost acres where we put toxic stuff, where we put our poison. Where do the German cars go? Where do the cell phones go? They end up in places like Ghana, around the area of Accra, and people are taking the horrible toxic stuff out of the cell phones, for instance. And so this is the global waste economy. There are 4 researchers involved. They come from different countries. Germany, you may wonder why Germany, but the reason is that the GDR and so West and East Germany were very uneven, and a lot of toxic waste was sold by the Western capitalists to the Eastern communists. And I'm exaggerating a bit, but I'm in Hungary, so it makes sense. So the communists, the GDR, was happy to get some West German money, and they took the toxic waste. How do you call this? Is it voluntary exchange because they get money for it, or is it forced, or is it a garbage imperialism? So this is the question, and they are studying cases around the globe. They are doing what you do normally, publish books. So 3 young scholars are publishing their doctoral dissertations, and they turn it into books. And the leader has finished her habilitation. It's a second doctorate. They do tweets, YouTube lectures. So this is what I mean by outreach and by what Rachel Carson was doing. They are not just sitting in the ivory tower, but they are translating their understanding, they are mediating their understanding to the outside world. And they have a virtual exhibition, and you can find that on the internet. Just punch in the life of waste and you'll find that it's a fascinating virtual exhibition. There are many more things that they published, but also they work with artists. Now, I'm using this project to show you what may be, well, a model project in terms of in a more abstract way. What is it about this project that makes it an environmental humanities, typical environmental humanities project? First of all, it is focusing on something topical, that is focusing on an urgent problem, the urgency of understanding where our waste goes. What are we doing? It's a political issue. The second thing is it's not just a political thing. It's what I told you before. It's about a dialogue between humans and nature. Once you put the waste somewhere, I mean, it's in itself natural. Chemistry and biology are not that far apart. But where does it go? Does it seep down rivers? Does it seep down in the groundwater? You have to understand nature, but you also have to understand the politics. So it's really a dialogue. It's about human actors, and it's about nature as an actor. And this is, for me, one of the most fascinating things. What is nature as an actor? I mean, that's one of the key questions for the environmental humanities. Nature is an actor too. Then this particular project has a transnational perspective and a global perspective, and it is about political, cultural, and economic contexts. I mean, what values do you have? It's a cultural question. What a value? What does waste mean for you? You don't want to see it in certain parts of the world. You just want to get rid of it. You want to have a white vest. It's good to not see it. That's a cultural thing. It's okay to accept it for money. It could also be a cultural thing, but it could still be highly problematic. And so looking at the political, the cultural, and the economic side all together is something that the environmental humanities will do. Taking a grounded, informed position on an ethical issue. This is an ethical issue. Ethics is about the question, what shall we do? What is good? What is the right thing to do? An ethical issue. And you need to, I mean, you can say, okay, you can condemn it and say, well, this is stupid. What you're doing, you're putting all your bad waste to a country that is a victim. And it's probably the right thing to say. But I think it has to be really grounded because, again, there are all these cultural issues involved. So asking ethical questions is also key. Ethicists should be involved, ideally, in an environmental humanities project. Lawyers should be involved, ideally, in an environmental humanities project. Because what are you allowed to do? What are you supposed to do? What is good to do? And then seeking exchange with stakeholders. So this project does exchanges with Greenpeace, for instance, and scientists, because you need to understand something about the toxic substances. If you write about toxic travels, about hazardous travel, it does make a difference how toxic it is and how quickly it will disappear. Including younger scholars is great, giving them a perspective, and I think there are a lot of projects and funding opportunities for younger scholars. And building international networks. So when people are working on India, for instance, we have, because of the Carson Center International Community, they have drawn on their board people who are experts on these countries. And then communicating, not just, this is another key feature, not just through books and research articles, scholarly articles, but communicating through other media. So in a way, these are key features. These are key features of an environmental humanities project. And if you design one, you can maybe use this list, and you don't have to tick all the boxes, but some of these are really helpful when you design a new research project. Teaching, I was involved in publishing this first article on teaching the environmental humanities. It was published in the journal Environmental Humanities, and I'm not going to summarize it because you can look it up. It's a long article, really long article. It was written by people from all over the world, from really started by Emily O'Gorman and Tom van Doren. They are in Australia. Ursula Münster is in Oslo, Joni Adamson in the US. And so there are many others involved in this article. And I will not tell you what this article says because you can read it quickly and focus on what you like. But I will tell you a little bit about some of the projects, teaching projects that I was involved in, the ones that I find are particularly exciting. The first one is field seminars. So this was a seminar in 2017 that we did together with the University of Madison, so the Carson Center, some geographers from our place, historians, went together. Our students and the students and professors from Madison, our partner university, did a Danube excursion. Of course, it would be nice to do something with you. This was just from all the way to Bratislava, not further down where you are. But it was really, really exciting. And I think this type of teaching is so important because within a very short time, you can understand things that you can never understand by reading books. You can never read as many books as you can understand by going into the field. So field seminars are extremely important, in my opinion, when you teach the environmental humanities. It's not, I see the faces of ethnologists, even though they're nodding, it's very different from participatory observation. So it's not, we don't stay in a place long, we just look at the space briefly, but it does make a difference. When you see, for instance, outside of Munich, you see the Alps, and you see in a river, you can see the structure, the geology, and you can see where this was at one point in a different place. So you will never forget about the rise of the Alps and how it happened. Once you see it yourself, it makes a difference. So we were trying to tackle this question, what the role of the river is along the Danube. And we have asked, how has the river shaped the lives of humans over time? How have humans shaped the river over time? So they've put dams in it. They've changed the course of the river to make it flow faster. Of course, the river has also changed the life of humans. There are multiple places, and there are some not so far from here, where people had to move because the river changed its course. So it is immediately clear when you go there, you'll never forget it. When you are in the field, you'll never forget that nature is an actor. Nature has power. So what did we do here? close observation and reading of nature. I always call it reading of culture and reading of nature needs to go together. So this dialogue is a reading of nature. I mean, here, by the way, this is you probably know this person. Oops, this was too quick. This is William Cronin, who some of you know from Madison, and a doctoral student from Munich, Martin Maiskin. They are observing some animals here in the wood. But reading nature can mean looking at plants. Why are certain plants in a certain place? Are they invasive? Where did they come from? Reading nature means reading geology, means reading even archaeology. I mean, how is it? Why do people settle in a certain place? So reading documents of nature and culture is something you can better do when you're outside in the field than in the classroom. The second thing that I find really important is moving through landscape as a research methodology. And here we are moving with a boat. In our Danube field seminar, we moved by bicycle, by foot, by train, by bus, etc., and by walking. And it does make a difference. What you observe, what you see, depending on the speed you walk through it, depending on whether you can stop or not. So using this not just as something, you go out for a Sunday walk. Every German goes out for a Sunday walk, at least in and then you go to a beer garden in the afternoon. But you also observe things that are very different from when you drive through the country. So moving at different speeds with different mobility is, I think, a research methodology that you can never get through books. The other thing is a multidisciplinary perspective, obvious. I mean, you can see here, for instance, and also dialogues and discussions with experts. This is actually in Bratislava, south of Bratislava. It's an engineer, a water engineer, who is explaining how the river course was changed. This is in a German park ranger who explained something about animals. And here are two people. So we meet these experts. They don't necessarily go on the bus all the time with us, not all the way down the river. You meet them in a place because they know their place best. So this is a case in point. The one guy on the left was the father of one of our doctoral students. He is a water engineer. And he designed dams that are not destructive to fish as much as they can be, so mini dams. So because the Danube is flooding a lot, I mean, even in Germany, and you need to build smaller dams are better than bigger dams and more dams. But what does it do to the environment? So here he talks to an ecologist. And you will never forget it when you're in the field. The ecologist was looking at the landscape and realized that in this area where the landscape was changed because of the dam, because of building of the dike, something happened that was not necessarily expected. The ecology was rather diverse because nobody was walking there. People totally ignored that dam and the dike. It's an area where nobody walks. So bringing people in a dialogue, bringing expert in a dialogue is totally fascinating. And we had on the Danube tour, among others, these people, geographers, obvious, ecologists, obvious, water engineers, historians, very obvious, anthropologists, important, architects. Well, architects, because in some of the cities that we looked at, they were regularly flooded. So what do you do? What type of architecture is best? We had an expert who worked both on the Danube and on Hurricane Katrina and was comparing it. It was fascinating to have this American architect come and look at the Danube, or urban planners. Also ichthyologists, they're fish experts. So in the Danube, we visited a place in Vienna. I think we had 18 experts altogether along the way. And one of them was an ichthyologist, and he would explain that some of the fish that are almost extinct would be raised in a basin and then put back as a measure against extinction. These are things you can never find this in a book. You cannot find it in 10 books or in 20 or 30 and 50 books. But the idea is to understand the river through many different disciplines and through the expertise of people from many different disciplines, including people who are actually working as practitioners, not just academics. And it's a research-based study. I think this is the other thing that's really great about the environmental humanities. So our students actually identified the sites, and they also co-taught. So here you see, this is a student, by the way, this is Greg Mittman, another professor from Madison. This is a student, historian of medieval environmental history. And there are people who would, I mean, we went to sites that the students identified. Some of the sites you would never think or see in a tourist book. Let's say the site of a medieval bridge. The medieval bridge is long gone, but it's the reason why a place along the river exists and it was thriving and why it's a medieval place. Because once you could cross the river on a bridge, you could ask for money for the toll, obviously, I mean for you because you're so close to the Danube, but I think it's something, you go to sites where you can't see anything, the invisible. And the students identified these sites and both, well, the students, the experts and the professors co-taught this class, which puts everybody on the same level. So there's no hierarchy. The students were actually better informed in some ways because they knew where we were going. They identified the site and they wrote a little book beforehand. They wrote blogs in the end. And in between, you know, we had the experts on site. And of course, permanent discussions over dinners, lunches, breakfasts in the hotel, and when you walk around. So there was no hierarchy. I mean, it doesn't matter who you talk to. As a student, everybody was the same. So this is what's so great about the field seminar. This is why I'm saying if you pursue this is, in my opinion, the best methodology for environmental humanities, but also exhibitions. And exhibitions fulfill another purpose, and that's you have to do something. You work together across disciplines. And it can be really, really, really difficult. I mean, I remember how anthropologists and biologists were fighting each other, students, because of the terminology. They hated each other. They had to find a common language, which is so difficult. But in an exhibition, you have to, as an environmental humanities scholar, you have to find a common language and you have to find a language that everybody can understand. So it's about communicating science. Writing text, it's very easy to write a complex text as an academic. And you all know that journal articles are not even read by 2 people in average. Nobody reads journal articles. They're just good for your career. I'm telling you, they're good for your career and to be cited, that's it. But it doesn't mean that what you learn has an impact and can be translated and told, communicated to people out there. And nothing is better than an exhibition to explain to a broader public what you're trying to do, because you have to find a simple language, a language that is can be understood by everybody. Here is an example, and I brought a book also for some of you, a catalog that came out of this student exhibition, and we looked at the history, the environmental history of Munich. Munich wouldn't exist without the Alps close by. Munich had the largest barge harbor in Europe because there was wood coming from the Alps and charcoal produced, so it was a coal island in Munich. Without the Alps, there would have not been Munich, because there would have been no wood and no charcoal. The river made the city. The city also made the river, because at one point it was channeled and then now we don't like it anymore, now it's rewilded. So we are permanently in a dialogue with the river. But that's just one of the many, many topics. You can find this also online. This is from the first exhibition that we did. I give you maybe one example. This thing is a windmill, obviously. It's the only windmill that the city of Munich has. They're so proud of it. But what is it sitting on? It's sitting on a hill that is a waste mountain. Not only that, the oldest church of Munich is sitting under this waste mountain. It's a medieval church. You can still enter it, but if you light a match, it explodes because everything is toxic in this mountain. So the students were identifying a site like this. It's a nature park with a windmill on top, but it's a toxic place. They also did a sound trail of the English garden, so they walked around the English garden, they interviewed the shepherd, they looked at the animals, the beavers, animals that you would not normally see. They talked to the conservation people, they looked at other aspects, the waste in the park. They try to understand the park through the sounds. So they created a walking tour through the English gardens. You put your headphones on, you can do a short walking tour or a long walking tour, and you get the sounds, for instance, of the sheep in the north there are sheep, and you can understand why, whether dogs are allowed or not and why not, things like that. But also there are interviews with people in the park, and you can walk through the park. So it's also a research methodology. Students go out and try to understand a space, and they make a soundscape out of it. What else shall I tell you? Oh, this stone rich means Munich is built on gravel. So the gravel from the Alps, everything is, what is gravel good for? I didn't know it. It's used for autobahns. It's also used for porcelain, to produce porcelain. You would probably know it here. But it's also used for toothpaste, for instance. But it helped Munich to be a beer city, because it's easy to dig down and have beer cellars. If you have a granite environment, you wouldn't have beer. Munich has this gravel environment, and the fact that you could have cold cellars, build them easily, makes a difference. But also, look at the vegetation, the chestnut trees. They are like umbrellas, but they're umbrellas against the rain, but they're also umbrellas against the sun, so that the beer is always underneath. Why are there chestnut trees? Things like this. This is what the students were finding in this exhibition. I could give you, there are now 12 stations, but this one, for instance, is about the democratic lawn. So originally, there was no democratic space in the aristocratic gardens. First of all, they shut off the city, so you thought in a landscape art garden, you thought you're in the middle of nature. Picturesque, it's beautiful, very few visitors through. But then in the 1970s, when the Olympics started, people said, we need to have an open area. We need to be transparent. We need to be anti-authoritarian, anti-aristocratic. It was the post-Nazi era, and shutting yourself off is a problem. So opening the space and being allowed to tread on the grass was a political issue. So we looked at the grass and how grass was, but the connotation, the meaning of grass in different areas. In the Nymphenburg Baroque Garden, look at Versailles. Do you know people in Versailles, they have to walk around in a certain way in the 18th century. Some people are allowed in some areas. They dress up in specific ways. They can see certain things that others can't see. But grass, whether you're allowed to tread on it or not, is a political issue. And it is something that needs to be discussed and is political and is historically interesting. So here is this is my last example, a pumpkin. So how much does it cost to produce a pumpkin in Munich? I told you before that it's so expensive to live in Munich. You cannot, so expensive, you pay 800 euros for a small room. So how much does it cost to plant a pumpkin? So the students worked out that it costs 500 euros to grow a pumpkin. So you can say, oh yeah, you can have a vision. You can think about, oh yeah, I want to have urban gardens. Why doesn't Munich have more urban gardens? Because the real estate is so expensive. So knowing what the obstacles are, knowing how valuable an urban natural space is in the city is something that the students found out. All these examples, they discovered themselves. And for me, it was totally eye-opening, and you can find many more examples on the internet when you Google Ecopolis Munich. And the second exhibition has more than that. Includes, for instance, railway areas, the airport, etc. This is something, okay, sometimes we have more people in the room than this. The Tuesday discussions in the Carson Center, they are a course that always gets the highest ratings. Students like that course the best. We sit in a space like this, and we invite somebody, let's say the head of the city planning office, or somebody from a Green Party, the member of parliament, or somebody from an environmental foundation, or somebody who does permaculture, people who are environmental experts, sometimes not quite environmental, Survival International, they focus on indigenous people, the rights of people versus nature. So these discussions, there's an expert who talks for 10 minutes, and after that, everybody gets engaged. It's the opposite of what I'm doing here. I'm just talking and talking. And I'm not even an environmental expert. But the great thing is that the students get to ask this environmental expert, it's amazing because the environmental experts like it and the students like it. The environmental experts like it because they get questions that they normally never get. And the students like it. I told you about the environmental studies program. Those who didn't go into the, let's say theology, if they studied theology but want to environment, most of them connected with people from the Tuesday discussions. So we had 150 people in the Tuesday discussions over the last 5 years. Maybe they're working for BMW Sustainability. Maybe they're working for Green City Munich. And when they now advertise an internship, they come to us and they say, do you have a student? And they end up in these professions. So it's a win-win situation. It connects us with environmental experts in the area. And I will tell you, this was also, this actually, to me, I didn't plan that. It was unintended. But when you do a European Union grant, you need often practitioners. You need an agency like a national park to be involved. And sometimes I remember it was Christmas, and we were a partner in a British project. And they said, we cannot submit because we don't have any environmental partners. And I said, no problem. And I called 2 people in a national park and in the city. And I said, can you please help us be our partners? And because they were at the discussion, they remembered us. And it was just a phone call at Christmas, actually the day before Christmas, the 23rd of December. Yes, we will send you a letter-headed, stamped affirmation, confirmation that we will work with you. So it is this is a simple thing, but it's pragmatic. This is a course. This is a course in environmental studies, but it's something that helps also research. So this connection between research and teaching is important, not just in the exhibitions, not just in field seminars, but also here, when you design new projects, it's important to not forget that practitioners ask important questions. The Alpine space we couldn't have done without this. So how are the environmental humanities relevant? And why now? I mean, the answer is very simple. It's 5 to 12, and well, I've spoken for 1 hour now. It's 3:05. But it's the environmental humanities are obviously relevant because of the urgency. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows these curves. Everybody knows how the climate, the hockey, how do you call it? I always forget it, the hockey curve, the hockey thing. Temperatures are rising. The curve of extinction is rising. Pollution, plastic in the oceans, the rise of fast food restaurants, paper production, everything that is destructive is rising at a record speed. Land use is rising. Think of, for me, one of the most shocking things is how much we're using up. Every year we're using the size of Germany up in terms of land consumption in the world. So, for instance, it's easy to visualize Africa. The size of Africa is what we need on Earth for pasture. It's cattle and sheep. The size of South America is with what we need for crops, like corn, wheat, etc. The size of Australia and Europe is what we need for forests, infrastructures, urban areas, etc., that we changed. The rest, about 44%. Much of it, the Sahara, the Himalaya, the Andes, you couldn't even live on. So we're using up space, and we're using up at record speed. And this is really a problem which shows the urgency. But for me, the one graph that is the most shocking is because of the rise of the population worldwide, extinction is enormous. And the extinction curve is steeper than the curve of demography. But extinction is not just something out there. A few more creatures are becoming extinct, a few more flowers, a few more trees, a few more birds, a few more fish, a few more invisible animals. But it's what we live on. And to think of that, this is why now. because of the steepness of the curve. I mean, the steeper the curve, the quicker the using up of space and of the environment. We are basically cutting off the branch of the tree on which we're sitting. The steeper this is. So what we have to do, and environmental humanities scholars have to do this, remember this curve. What we have to do, whatever we do, we have to change this curve. We have to flatten it and bring it down if humans should live on this planet in the future. So why now? I think the answer is obvious. What was my other question? Oh, what are they good for? Well, it's easy. I think a doctor knows what medicine is good for. You heal patients, and a bridge builder knows, when you study that, you know what you do. But even environmental humanities is not very easy. Which nuts can we crack? I think what we are good at is thinking with complexity. And what I mean, to give you an example of today, I mean, maybe in 2008, at least I was so naive, I thought, okay, now we've got the economic crisis. Once we have overcome this crisis, it's over. But after that came, I mean, it was so obvious that climate, all the IPCC reports showed us that we are really endangering our planet because of climate gases. I thought, okay, here's the second crisis, the one is over, the next one is coming, but we're managing it somehow. But then came the pandemic, and now is the war. So there are all these overlapping crises that enforce each other. Who can give an answer? Does an engineer give an answer? I have a friend who works in the Ford factory. He has, I think, 18 people who, he says, we're doing something environmental. We're thinking about the sound of the engine of an electric car. There are psychologists, engineers. What should it sound like? So it sounds like a Ford and not like a Mercedes. What should it sound like so that people can actually hear the sound? I mean, yes, it's important, but 18 people are working on it. And it's very, very focused, and it doesn't save us. It's not something that, if we communicate that, it doesn't do very much. I think environmental humanities scholars have this task of, in a situation of multiple crises, we need to think holistically. We need to think very different factors together, overlapping, overarching, reinforcing, mutually reinforcing factors together. I think this is what we are good at, because we are trained as environmental humanities scholars to not just think about the environment, but also about culture. Why is it not happening? Because, why? I mean, you can't change everything. You can't say to people in Argentina, get rid of all your cattle, because that's a livelihood. You can't say, get rid of, we were just talking about Siberia. What happens if no more fossil fuel is extracted? Whole cities that were created for that will be gone. So thinking about consequences, that if you change one thing has what it does to other factors. In a way, the Rubik's Cube? When you change the Rubik's Cube a little bit, you think, I've almost got it. Now everything is blue. No, you change one thing and there's an unintended consequence. And this is what I mean by complex thinking. It means that you have to realize technologically or empirically minded, I'm contrasting this, and I think empirical research is extremely important, and so is engineering, but they're so focused, like the person in the Ford factory, but they're so focused on one thing. And so they change a Rubik's Cube and they don't necessarily think of what it means. Yes, I mean, the electric car, is that the solution? All of a sudden we're praising it as a solution. We all know it isn't. So thinking in a complex way is what we can learn as environmental humanities scholars. And I think we have to explain that also to policymakers. You need us. You need people who can think what one little change does. When you build a road through the jungle, what species are gone? What long-term effect does it have? By the way, this was a Shakespeare quote, "Time is out of joint." Oh God, I've used these horribly to make it sound important. These words: synergetic, value-oriented, forward-looking thinking. So if you have these crises that they're reinforcing themselves, and you want to get out of the crisis, if you want to flatten that curve, you have to also come up with something that addresses all these different issues in a positive way. So how do you do that? Promote positive values that reinforce each other. It's very easy to say that, but I give you a few examples. I mean, I thought of a few things that could help you understand what I'm trying to say here. If you can still follow me after such a long time.
Cannot you see our eyes?
So, if you create a livable city, a livable city is a city, for instance, that has trees, where the ways are short, where you don't necessarily need a car, where you have an environment where people are happy. This city, so it's about nature. What sort of nature do you have? By the way, there's a long discussion about which, in Munich, which is the city tree of the future. Because of climate change, we have to change it. I could talk for an hour about the city tree of Munich, because the tree that we now have is a problem because of the insects and the window shields, and people don't like the excrement of the insects on the window shields. Linden trees are a problem, you can imagine. So think about trees, think about mobility, think about spaces. Which spaces make you happy in a city? I mean, this city is wonderful. I'm amazed that people want to move out of it. I would live here in a heartbeat. It's a wonderful city. But this is not only good for people who live here, but it's good for their health. I mean, it's not only good because they have shorter ways, it's good for the climate because they need less CO2. So that's what I mean by reinforcing positive values. I'll give you a couple of other examples. There's actually two examples in one. Let's say if you end the fossil fuel era, it has a positive impact. You don't become dependent in terms of petro-imperialism, and it has a positive impact on the climate. The same with the hazardous waste that I gave you as an example before. If you get rid of plastic waste, if you get rid of hazardous toxic waste, it has a positive impact on the environment, but also on the health, because otherwise you're eating it someday. So changing one tile in this Rubik cube has a positive impact, and I think we have to think about those. It's an exercise of thinking. It's a philosophical exercise. It's a creative exercise. Think about something that has multiple positive meanings. I think that's something that the environmental humanities should be doing. And my last example is, obviously, I mean, we all know that cows, especially monoculture is bad because it brings down diversity in the world. We rely almost entirely on 5 animal species and on 12 crop species, even though we could eat 2,500 crop species. We're focusing on very few. This creates a monocultural world. We get rid of the diversity. It's not just a question of how much consumption of land we have, but also, is it still diverse or is it monocultural? So, but we also know if we don't do intensive livestock farming, then that is good for animals, because these animals are not living happily, but it's also good for our health and it's good for the climate. So think in these, it's again complex thinking. What are the environmental humanities good for? How can we do something? What is the value? The value is that we can actually think not just about multiple crises, but we can also think about multiple, I don't like the word solutions, but about looking forward in a positive way. Okay, another stupid invention. I call it the epistemic mode of the why not, so that it sounds a bit scholarly. What I mean is, ask questions. Ask any type of crazy question. That's what the environmental humanities should be doing. Why not? Why not think things differently? Maybe I'll give you a really crazy example. It just came to me this morning. So why do we call countries in sub-Saharan Africa developing countries? Why don't we call Western Europe and the US developing countries? It's every reason to say that we have to develop. We have to develop a new understanding of the environment. It's radically different from what we've been thinking, but why not? The environmental humanities should ask these type of questions. There's one question that has been asked for a few years now that seems crazy. It still seems crazy, even to me, even though I like to use it. It's the derechos de la naturaleza, the rights of nature. It comes out of Latin America. Because in indigenous cultures in Latin America, there's no distinction between mountains and rivers and plants and stones. Everything is animated. Everything is nature. It doesn't matter whether you're human or you're a stone. Everything is nature. So everything should have the same right. The rights of nature. So if you have the same rights, where do you get your rights? You get them in front of a court. So why should a river not go to court? You can think this is crazy, but those who invented this and had a discourse about it, they will say, there have been crazy things about that. People say, okay, the river, it's owned by somebody, it's just a property, it's an object. But in the 19th century, women or slaves in America were objects. Everybody said, this is property. They have no rights. They cannot go in front of a court. So why can't nature be in front of a court? And there have been successful court cases. So ask stupid questions, because they will turn out to be creatively imaginative and interesting, and they can revolutionize our thinking, and that is exactly what we need. We look at the literature, look at the scientific literature. I told you nobody reads it. We read a little. And the students who prepare these exhibitions or the field trips, they read as much as they can. But we know everything. We know. There's nobody who can tell me that global warming is not happening. We know that we're destroying the planet. We know it. What we don't do is act. We simply don't act. So, because we have the knowledge, so what the task and the value of the environmental humanities is to act. And we can do that by finding effective ways of communicating. And who is good at understanding communication, if not humanities scholars or social scientists? This is the value of the humanities here, that we know what sort of language we need to speak. We can imagine things because we know something about novels. We know something about art. We know something about this Hundertwasser, it's art and it's architecture. But you can also think of novels that create better worlds. There are some really bad novels. I usually talk about bad novels, who sometimes have really wonderful. There's a great novel about Portland. It's one of the worst novels that I've read, but it's really wonderful. And basically, Portland in Oregon, in the US, used this novel to reinvent itself. It's so bad that I can't even remember the name of it. But you can find it. Here is another thing that I find important as a historian, and Anna mentioned my little essay or book called Slow Hope. I think there's hope if you go back in history. You can find precarity in history, you can certainly find disaster in history, but you can also look at history and look where things have changed for the better in history, and use those examples, accumulated examples, to understand that there is reason for hope, and to analyze the examples where things were worse in the past and why they have become better. Look at forests. In the old times, what was wood good for? Wood was good as firewood. Wood was good to build cabins. Wood was good to build ships. Wood was good to make money. Was good as soon as it was timber, not as a tree. At one point, probably around the late 19th century, we understood that wood is more than timber. The forest is something, if you go there, it feels good, it's healthy. We now understand that climate change can be dampened by having forests. So forests have a cooling effect. Forests have an anti-erosion effect. Forests have multiple functions, ecological functions. But not only that, in recent years we understood something else that is radical. It's a why not sort of answer. Forests are communicating. We know there's this German guy, I would call him an environmental humanist, he's a forester who wrote this popular book about the secret life of trees, and his name is Wohlleben, which means well living. I mean, if you have a name like that, you probably write books like that if you're a forester. But we now know that trees are communicating with each other through fungi, through their roots. The trees wouldn't be higher than this without the fungi. They can feed each other, like a trunk that is almost dying can be fed by another tree. So what does this tell me? Why do I say that there is slow hope? It took a long time for us to understand that a tree is more than wood and a forest is more than a tree. But it's happened. So analyzing this and understanding that there are stories that are hopeful is important, and the humanities can do that. Collect multiple stories, and that's what I try to do in my little book, Slow Hope. The importance of stories. This is a story, my favorite story. It's the Prometheus story. Prometheus is the guy who stole the fire from the gods, and he had to suffer, so every night the bird came who ate his kidney. No, his liver, sorry. I always mix it up. It's his liver. Doesn't matter. Kidney or liver, it's horrible. He had to suffer. And at night, the liver was eaten. During the day, it grew back. At night, it was eaten. If you're telling this story to a kid will know, okay, here's a guy who did something wonderful, but he had to suffer for it. It's a story that transports an enormous complexity, and you can use it for all sorts of examples of what we are doing to our environment today. For instance, we are taking enormous risks. We are polluting the environment. We are creating comfort, like Prometheus brought fire. That gave us comfort. It made us move around. It made us warm in the wintertime, but it also was destructive. So understanding a story like this as a story of risk and vulnerability is something that gives us, myths, ancient myths are capturing very wise philosophies in a story that you will not forget. And this is what neuroscientists have found out, that stories, we can memorize them much better than other things, much better than scientific texts, obviously. So there's a memory function to them. There's an identification function. By that I mean, when you see this story of Prometheus or any other story, you can imagine you are yourself Prometheus. And that's important when you want to change behavior, that you imagine that you should act. What do you do against it? You want the fire, but you don't want to be destroyed. So what do you do? How do you get rid of the bird? And that, of course, has something to do with the transformative power. We know that it's much better if you want to change behavior and ideas and values and belief systems to learn from a story than from a graph or from statistics or from texts or scientific articles. So stories are important. That's why humanities scholars are important, because they're experts on stories. And then there's the importance of language. One of my favorite philosophers is the language philosopher Richard Rorty, an American, who says that language is important for cultural change. I always use the example of Donald Trump. He doesn't have very good arguments, often. I don't know, maybe you believe it, but I don't. And there was a time when we all believed that the better argument would win. Certainly my neighbor, where I live at Lake Starnberg, Jürgen Habermas, had this idea that the better argument should win. But we know that it's not only important to have a good argument, but it's probably much more important when you want to change something culturally, to think of the language, the media that is used. So I think it was really important that Trump, with no argument, but with a sort of medium that was used, Trump could get people to rethink things. So it can be a source of danger, but it can also be a medium that helps us transport stories. Analyze this medium, analyze the language in which we speak, is really important if you want to change behavior. And then, okay, this is with a smiley face or with a twinkle. What are the environmental humanities good for, and what are they good against? They're a vaccine against, they're an antidote against the matter-of-factness of science and engineering. So what I mean by that is this can be so dry to have a science article. It's much more creative to do environmental humanities. They are good against disciplinary and scholarly isolation. If you focus on, I have a friend who was a pharmacologist in Oxford. One day he realized he wouldn't become a Nobel Prize winner, and he gave up. He was working on this whole thing, serotonin, all his life for decades. And one day he said, I've He was not interested in anything else. He didn't have to talk to any other discipline. But as environmental humanities scholars, you have to cross the corridor and talk to people from other disciplines, which means you are pulling yourself out of isolation, out of spatial isolation and out of disciplinary isolation. So it's good against this isolation. They're good against this culture of predictability. I mean, I don't know what example to give you. Who are we relying on? We're relying on politicians, are relying on economists mostly. They didn't foresee the 2008 economic crisis. They were really bad. They were totally surprised. They come up with quantitative science that tells us this is where we will end up over time. This is where we end up eventually because this is what the numbers tell us. But the prediction, the predictability, the quantitative prediction has a lot of problems because you look at one line and you leave the context out and you forget about unintended consequences. Also what I call solutionism. You find, as a scientist, you find a problem and you just solve it. You find a problem with the sound of an engine and you solve it with 18 people. But there are so many other aspects that you forget. So environmental humanities is an antidote against predictability and solutionism. Environmental humanities are also an antidote against provinciality, because nature knows no borders. You know that, yeah, I don't have to explain that, it's obvious. And they are also helping us to bring in values and ethics. So not just to thinking about humans, but also more than humans. So they're good for a lot of things, and they are good against a lot of things. I have 5 minutes left, or 7. And I'm coming to the perspectives for the future, and I wish I knew where to go. The easiest would be not to go anywhere, and I actually mean it. And I mean it literally, especially when you live in Pécs. So what I'm telling you, first of all, stay here. Explore. Gabor, I know you know Papua New Guinea, and it's really important. And I would say it's also important to translate things that you learn from other cultures to the place where you live. But it's really important to understand nature and culture in the place where you live, whether you study something else. But understanding the place where you live is a great starting point. And I noticed that late in my life. So I'm an expert on America. Not that I ever studied American studies, but I'm a chair in American culture, so I should be one. I've been writing books about American secret intelligence and stuff like that. But I realized that it's so important to understand. This is why I'm focusing now on the Bavarian forest and on Munich, because it's important to understand. It's also fun to understand. It's easy. It uses less CO2 to study where you're coming from. So this is what I'm suggesting. Do a lot of your research here. You can also use what you find here and explore somewhere else and compare, but start here. So where should you be going? Stay or be grounded here. And then I'm using another, like a crazy term. I call it earthicize me, not supersize me, but earthicize me. And I mean, look at the ground on which you stand. Look at the earth. I think it's really, really important to understand the earth. We lost 50% of the topsoil. And you see the topsoil is the only thing that where you can actually plant plants. Everything that we lost 50% in 150 years. You can imagine how quickly we lose everything. We lost in the Dust Bowl. We lost it through sealing off. In 150 years, we lost so much of the topsoil. We are getting rid of the branch on which we are sitting. Think about the earth. Think about it as something that we need in the future. But the earth has a double meaning. It's also think about the planet. So think within the planetary, realize that this is our only thing. So earthicize me means think about the ground on which we stand, but also think that the area that humans can live on is limited. We only have one earth, not more. And what I mean also here is really think of earthworms. I was really shocked natural catastrophes happen elsewhere, but last year we had a lot of floods in Germany. Hundreds of people died. Villages were gone, whole rows of houses were gone because the river flooded in certain areas. And it has a lot to do, not least with creatures like this, the earthworm. We lost 45% of the earthworms in Germany in 10 years. If there are no earthworms, then the earth is much more prone to flooding. Earthworms were killed, firstly because we got rid of the brushes and the clover that they eat, they need to survive. We also got rid of the earthworms because they were paralyzed because of our pesticides. So think about the livelihoods. They are co-created by other animals, not just by humans. This is really, really important. The environmental humanities, even though they're called humanities, need to think about more than human species, like rainworms, or smaller ones, like this one. Small as a thumbnail. Mosquitoes. As an Americanist, I can tell you, I can explain that to you if you want, but I can tell you the mosquito was more important in winning the Revolutionary War for the Americans than George Washington. George Washington was a really bad general. He may have been a great president, but he was a bad general. And the immunity of those who had already lived in the land against malaria because of the mosquito was more decisive than anything else. Think about other creatures. They had an impact on politics, on wars, on everything. I mean, I don't have to tell you now in a pandemic, you know that little creatures that you cannot see are important. My last example here, it's really complicated. I don't know whether I can explain it to you. I will try. First of all, I always find it's important to realize, I mean, when I grew up, America was the country of cowboys and Indians. But before Columbus, there were no cowboys and Indians. And why? Because there were no horses and no cows. Columbus brought them. So thinking of Native Americans who sit on horses, they don't exist before Europeans come over. But also cows, cowboys. First of all, we drink milk here. In Asia, many people cannot drink milk because their bodies haven't changed, haven't adapted. We can drink milk in our part of the world because our bodies have changed over time. These cows that you can see here, these cattle, they were able to carry themselves to the market. They were able to survive because they were semi-wild in the 19th century. They came from Asia, they came through Latin America, they were domesticized, but the ones who were rewilded were able to survive on their own before there was the opportunity with barbed wire to fence them in. So they could survive because of these horns. They could open the snow and eat something in the wintertime. They could defend themselves against animals. So they survived. If you look at Texas, if you look at Kansas, if you look at all these rich ranches, they wouldn't exist if they were not co-created by the cows. The cows saved these cowboys and the ranchers a lot of money because they carried themselves to the market and from there, from the railway station to the slaughterhouse. The money that built the houses of the ranchers was co-produced by the cows. And the co-evolution of humans and cows, the sort of meat that we eat today, you wouldn't, I mean, we have in the garden where I come from, Swiss water pears, you can't eat them. They're horrible, but they taste like in the Middle Ages, but they're good for making schnapps and cider. Fruits have there's a co-evolution of fruit, there's a co-evolution of flora, there's a co-evolution of fauna, and animals and humans have lived together. Thinking animals and humans together, not just the landscapes we change, this is really important and a lot is done, but thinking bioculturally means thinking humans and non-humans together. And then this is just a word that I like, ecoscopic. I used that for Rachel Carson at one point. Rachel Carson, I realized, was looking into the microscope and into the binoculars. So she was interested in what happened far away and into what happened in the micro area. But I think we need something else. We need to think ecoscopically, not only microscopically, but also ecoscopically, which means in ecological entanglements. Everything is connected with everything else. Microbes, viruses, animals, plants. Look at the world with an ecoscopic view, That's what the environmental humanities can do. And finally, this is my last slide, or second from last. Planetary well-being, we just started a project called on planetary health, communicating planetary health. I think it makes a lot of sense. It goes back to my earthicide slide, to think about both things together. The planet and humans and our ecosystems. So if the planet is healthy, then humans and more than human species are healthy. Think in the macro dimension and think in the micro dimension. That's also an ecoscopic view. Don't think them separately, think them together. And probably this is the most important thing that we should strive for. And probably, I mean, in theory, the European Union wants to do that. I think our goal, at least programmatically, is to think in planetary boundaries and living well in planetary boundaries. And I think the environmental humanities can contribute to this. And so why study it? I think the answer, I've given you the answer. I hope I've given you the answer. Why study the environmental humanities? I mean, why not? And obviously because they are timely and relevant, but also because I think they're fun. So thank you very much.